I'm reading for you 12 stories for the 12 days of Christmas, and I bring to you When Father Christmas Was Young by Coningsby Dawson. Someone had hinted that there wasn't a Santa Claus. If there wasn't, who brought Christmas presents? For weeks, when Mac had been put to bed and was supposed to be asleep, he had lain awake puzzling. He had reached the point at which suspense ached like a guilty conscience. He simply had to share his secret with a wiser person. He had postponed and postponed, till at last it was Christmas Eve. All day Daddy had been finishing a story. Daddy could be so inconvenient. When he was finishing a story, he turned the key in the lock, and everybody went on tiptoe. Mac had returned from his afternoon walk with Nanny. Streets and stores had been happily decorated in excited preparation. To make things perfect, snow was falling. Mac had prayed for snow. He'd set himself a task which was nothing less than to prove that Santa Claus existed. If there was snow on the housetop, it would be impossible for old Santa to tether his reindeer to the chimney without leaving tracks. And now to take Daddy into his confidence. Having escaped from the nursery, he twisted the handle of the study door. It wasn't locked. An instant later, a jolly voice invited him to enter. Across the threshold, he halted, his fat legs astride, a worried expression on his cherubic countenance. "I've been thinking, Daddy." "You don't say, old son. Climb on my knee and tell me." The red lacquer room, with the fire shining, afforded a friendly setting. Yet Mac couldn't blurt out the wicked heresy he had overheard. Instead, he cuddled against the smoking jacket and asked, "Who was Santa when he was young? He's terribly old now, but he must have been little at one time. Who taught him to be fond of reindeer and to come down chimneys and to leave presents? Was he the first to do things like that, or did he have a mommy and a daddy who did them before him?" His father filled and lit his pipe. "I'm afraid you'll consider me a most ignorant parent. I don't know the answer to a single one of your questions. I ought to. I've no excuse. With your help, I propose to educate myself. Do you see all those books, the tall ones? They're books of reference, which means that they can answer anything. All you have to do is to open them and turn to the word potato, for instance. Every fact about a potato is recorded. Let's make a game of it and go on a hunt." "What shall we look for?" Daddy prompted. "Santa Claus." Daddy ran his eyes along the shelves. "Who's who in America? We shan't find him mentioned. He's international. Let's try the encyclopedia." But the encyclopedia proved stodgy. As soon as you hit on what you thought you wanted, it referred you to another volume. Having looked up Santa Claus, you were at once informed that you ought to have looked up St. Nicholas. And when you looked up St. Nicholas, you were told that he had lived in a funny place called Myra at Lycia. In fact, he'd been a bishop who had been tortured to death. He had gained the reputation of being fond of children. In England alone, 400 churches had been dedicated to his memory. Each of them contained a stained glass window, representing him pulling 3 little boys out of a tub. "That's silly, Daddy. Why a tub?" "Goodness knows. But listen, Doodles, this is interesting. He's the Russian Santa Claus and the greatest saint in Russia. That brings him close to reindeer. Reindeer live up north in Lapland. And here's something else. After he had been dead for hundreds of years, some people from another city stole his bones, made a huge procession, and built an enormous church over him. After which all the world started to make pilgrimages to his sepulchre. He worked miracles, especially for children." "Go on, Daddy, read more." "It ends there," Daddy frowned. "Darn the idiots. They always dry up when you're hoping to learn something. Tell you what, the last volume is an index. We'll look up Christmas." The items recorded about Christmas were even more confusing. The origin of the Yule log was traced of the Lord of Misrule. In olden days, it appeared the Lord of Misrule, a sort of clown, was appointed to direct the Christmas festivities. He was king for a day, who did whatever he pleased while the season lasted. In still older days, he'd been the king of the Roman Saturnalia, and had been killed at the end of the revels for having made himself a nuisance. Very interesting. Daddy banged the volume back on its shelf. That helps a lot. Taking down another volume, he struck luck and grew good-humored. He had run across the name of Befana. "By Jove, that's a new one." The little boy peered over his shoulder. The words were too long for him to spell. "Is it about reindeer, Daddy?" "It isn't. It's about stockings. According to what's printed here, this Befana was a fairy. The 3 wise men on their journey to Bethlehem passed by her cottage, and she was busy, or too disagreeable to look out the window. Said she'd seen them when they came back. Of course, they didn't come back on account of Herod. Her punishment was to gaze in vain from her window for them always." "Is she still gazing, Dad?" "I expect so. But that's not all. She was given a second punishment. On the anniversary of the night when she'd been too busy to see the wise men pass, she was ordered to fill children's stockings. But the angel who ordered her punishment was careless. What he'd meant was that she must fill children's stockings with presents. He didn't say with presents. He forgot. As she was spiteful, what do you think she did? She filled the children's stockings with ashes." "She doesn't now. I never found no ashes in my stocking," Mac objected. "Neither did I," Daddy agreed. "Something that these stupid books don't relate must have happened." "Then look up stockings," Mac suggested. "We'll find the rest of the story." "Afraid not." Daddy shoved the book back on the shelf disgustedly. "The trouble with the fellows who write all of this learned rot is that they aren't poets. If they were going to discover the truth about when Father Christmas was young, we'll have to make it up." "Are we poets?" The little boy blushed at the compliment. "You bet. At least you are. All children are poets. You are much wiser than these encyclopedia fellows. We believe in Santa Claus, you and I." They don't and didn't. They were like Befana, who might have ridden with the wise men to Bethlehem if only she hadn't been too busy to have faith. "Can't one be busy if one has faith?" the little boy inquired. "Not often. Being busy kills faith as a rule. I've been busy lately, too busy. That's why I'm appealing to you. You're not too busy because you're young. That's the reason you ought to believe in almost everything, if you try. I'm certain you can tell me about Santa's boyhood." They shifted the lamp so that it spilled a pool of illumination over the deep armchair. Minutes ticked by. They sat as though merged into one. "I'm waiting," Daddy urged. "Don't know where to start." "That's obvious. With Befana. She lived in a forest so dark that she hardly ever saw the sun. A high road ran through it, along which camels plodded with their tinkling bells. You see, even I know that." "I know more." Mac wagged a finger, imitating one of Father's gestures. "Then, for the love of Mike, prove it." "Befana was like you, Daddy. When you're finishing a story, she was cross. But she wasn't bad." "Is that so?" Daddy chuckled. "Thanks for your frankness." "Yes, that's so, Daddy. If she wasn't finishing something, she was hurrying to begin something." "What sort of thing, Doodles?" "Don't exactly know. But yes, I do." Mac corrected himself. She was a writer of fairy stories. She lived in the dark forest 'cause she simply had to be quiet, same as you lock your door. She never could find time to do her housework. So she was very glad one morning when she opened her door and saw Santa on her step. What on earth was he doing there? He wasn't doing nothing. He'd been left. Someone passing with the camels had dropped him. He was as tiny as a doll. He couldn't even talk, and the bottle beside him was empty. Befana took him in and stared. She twiddled his toes, and he laughed. She thought, he's an orphan. I can keep him. I'll learn him to do my housework. Teach, Mackie, not learn. All right, teach, Mac conceded. But it don't make no difference. Not till evening, when she was putting him to bed, did she learn that he was called. A piece of paper had been pinned to him, and it said Nick written on it. That was what he was called first. The Santa name came after. Did he ever have a beard? Daddy questioned. Course not, nor no hair. He was a baby. Mac cuddled closer. Befana washed his bottles and pushed his pram through the forest. She was sorry for him, but he was an awful bother. I'm surprised to hear that she was sorry for him. Daddy attempted to guide the story. A fairy who could be so cruel as to put ashes into children's stockings. But listen! Max seized his father's chin. She wasn't married. She didn't know about children. She spoiled him and upset his stomach. She let him sit up late, the way you let me on Christmas. She did it every night, and she gave him candies before breakfast. Extremely foolish. Daddy looked shocked. Why did she? To keep him quiet, so she could do her fairy stories. As he grew bigger, he learned to talk. She couldn't write when people talked. To get rid of him, she ordered him to do all the housework, which was hard for a little boy, and he cooked the meals and he swept and dusted. Befana must have been a very lazy lump, Daddy interrupted. Didn't she help him? She was always writing. Jack and the Beanstalk was one of hers, so was Cinderella. Oh, almost all of them. I believe you are inventing. Daddy squinted down his nose. Truth and honor I'm not, Mac asserted. Her fingers was inky. Nick would call to her to come and play. She would shake her head. He was most awfully lonely. When he dusted the cottage, he'd go out and sit by the road to watch the camels pass. He would wonder where the camels were going and wish he could follow them. Sometimes he'd wonder whether they were driven by people who had dropped him. He was about as big as me, when one day coming terrible fast. How fast would you say, Mackie? As fast as when we ride in a taxi. There was 3 racing camels, each with a man sitting on 'em, and the men wore crowns and was all dressed up. You knowed they must be kings. A great white star floated over them just above the branches. It made the forest, which was always dark, quite bright. Naturally, he guessed something wonderful was going to happen. Naturally, Daddy nodded. Well, little Nick, who was no bigger than me, thought they were going to push past him, but they saw him in time, and they pulled up. Little boy, one of them asked, where's Bethlehem? He said more than that. Daddy wished to be helpful. He said, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. Perhaps he did, Mac grudgingly agreed. Nick was so little he'd never heard of Bethlehem. He asked the wise men to wait a minute while he runned in and asked Aunt Befana. He was breathless when climbed the stairs to her study, and the door was locked. When he tapped, she didn't answer, and then he started to explain, the way I do to you, Daddy, through the keyhole. Go away, she grunted. The wise man was in a hurry, so Nick didn't dare stop longer. He had to go back and say that Aunt Befana was too busy even to answer their question. They rode away very sad, the stars sailing over them. Soon the forest grew dark, like it always was. The night at supper, Nick told Aunt Befana how they'd rode on, racing camels wearing crowns, so that he was sure they were kings. Kings don't wear crowns when they ride camels. You're fibbing, she said. She didn't want to believe that he was telling the truth, so he got punished. Next day, she couldn't write fairy tales for fancying what she missed. She'd never seen 3 kings all together. She made Nick come to her study and promised not to discipline him again. But you're forgetting, Mackie. I didn't halt you before because I hoped you might remember. 2 of the kings were old, but the 3rd was young. The young one had told Nick why they were in such a hurry to reach Bethlehem. A baby was born who would be king of the whole world. When he grew up, he would be king especially of children. He would take them in his arms and play with them. Nick had never been properly loved, and he'd never been played with at all. He wished he'd been born later, so he could have played with the king of children. As it was, he'd be a man by the time the king was grown up, so he'd be too big for the king to take him in his arms. Most of this he said to Befana. The more he talked about the wise men, the more sorry she became that she hadn't taken the time off to see them. But I haven't missed much, she pretended. They'll be coming back. As you know, Doodle, they didn't. 'Cause of Herod. Precisely. They were warned in a dream that Herod would seek the child to slay him, so they went back to the east secretly, a different route. But Befana didn't know they'd been warned. Max seized the telling of the story. Every day she sat by her study window watching. She hid behind her curtains, ashamed, so Nick wouldn't see her and would think she was writing. And Daddy, I forgot to tell you, she kept the table spread for 5 instead of 2. You see why, don't you? So as to be ready to invite the 3 kings to eat a meal with her, whatever hour they returned. Do you know that's very interesting? People still do that in Russia. They bake king's cakes and put it outside the door on Christmas Eve to let the 3 kings know they're welcome. Befana did the same. Mac nodded like a turtle. She called it king's cake, too. But don't you think, Daddy, that you could tell a little of the story? With pleasure. Daddy stroked the narrow shoulders. As the news began to spread about the wonder child who had been born at Bethlehem, she regretted everything most dreadfully. One day, when she was watching the road, she saw a man who looked like a man, yet wasn't, approaching through the forest. She saw him stop little Nick to pat his head. The next moment, he was tapping at her cottage. He wore wings, didn't he, Daddy? He may have. But if he wore wings, Daddy, even though his coat was over them, they would be lumpy. I expect they were, but the humps aren't important. The important thing is that he'd been sent to punish her. Long after the angel had gone away, she stayed locked up in her study. When she came down to supper, little Nick could see by the redness of her eyes that she'd been crying. Of course, you and I know that the angel had told her that she must watch forever for the wise men, and that once a year she must fill children's stockings. But why had she been crying, Daddy? Because as long as she lived, she'd never have to write any more fairy tales. Don't forget, Mac, that till now she'd been a most distinguished authoress. Little Nick didn't know why she'd been crying, and he didn't dare ask. The first hint he got was next morning. Having swept out the fireplace, he was throwing away the ashes. "Don't do that," she snapped. "Take them back. We're going to save them." Overnight, she'd been thinking hard with what she was going to fill the children's stockings. She decided on ashes. According to you, when first she saw Nick on her doorstep, she was rather sorry for him. She wasn't any longer. She grew crankier and crankier because her punishment, she grew to hate children. Little Nick was the child who came handiest. She was perfectly horrid to him. She kept him always working at dirty jobs. She complained of the meals he prepared for her, and because he was dirty, refused to sit down with him. As it came near Christmas, Mac took up the running. She grew nervouser and nervouser. She'd been counting her ashes and was certain there wasn't enough to fill all the stockings. So what did she do? She thought of soot. There wasn't much difference between soot and ashes. She made poor Nick climb her chimney to shake the soot down. "You're probably correct," Daddy said, "but it doesn't sound sensible." It wasn't. Mac clapped his hands gleefully. It wasn't his fault. Befana made him. That was how he learned the habit. When he was young, he climbed up them. Now he's old, he climbs down them. "I see," Daddy smiled, "at what you're driving at." When the first Christmas Eve came, right after the wise men had passed, Mac continued, Nick was awful tired. All day he'd been tying up ashes in sacks. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Befana surprised him. She said she'd be gone for the whole night, and he must hang up his stocking. He asked why his stocking. She told him that the next morning, if he looked in it, he'd find something. So he went to bed early and closed his eyes tight. He was so excited. He wanted morning to come quicker and quicker. He thought his Aunt Befana had gone to town to buy a wonderful present, and instead, when he woke up, looking in his stocking, Doodles, we know what he found. It was cruel of her. And there she was, back for breakfast, as though nothing had happened, Daddy, and all the sacks was disappeared. How had she carried them? She was a fairy, by magic. Every Christmas after that she always did the same, and Nick was always hoping that instead of ashes, he'd find a present. He never did, of course. Max shook his head dolefully. That's why he's kind to boys and girls. He remembers how sad he was. When he growed up, he ran away from Befana and became a saint for children. He washed them. Again his father was astounded. Washed them? Who told you that? Those tall books. They said that there was hundreds of churches with picture windows showing Santa pulling 3 little boys out of a tub. He was washing them, 'cause when he was young, he'd hated to be dirty. That was how he got killed and became a saint, 'cause people was so angry with him for washing their children. He never asked if he might, so he just did it. Perhaps there is another mystery you can clear up. Daddy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Being a saint, though having been martyred, he went through to heaven. On earth for many years he was forgotten. Then the people from another town stole his body, honored him by building a huge church over him, and were rewarded by finding that his tomb worked miracles. According to the encyclopedia, the miracles started pilgrimages. Sick little children were brought to touch his tomb and were instantly cured. Now, as everybody knows, the sickness children usually have is the tummy ache. Why should he have been so good at curing that? The reply came promptly. 'Cause he'd always had a tummy ache himself. He sat up too late. I've told you that. And Befana, knowing nothing about children, allowed him to eat candy before breakfast. Your explanation sounds reasonable, Doodles, but for the life of me, I don't see how our story goes on. It's only begun, Daddy. Santa wasn't happy in heaven. 'Cause why? 'Cause he kept on thinking about Befana was still filling children's stockings with ashes. He went to God and told him how miserable he'd been every Christmas morning when he'd been little. He said, "'Tisn't right to be miserable Christmas morning. Chillens will always be miserable so long as they find ashes. If no one else wants to do it, I'm going to give them presents." And God thought the idea splendid. Daddy's tone was delighted. In order that Santa might get to all the stockings before Befana filled them with ashes, he lent him the 3 wise men's camels, and they were racing camels. "But he uses reindeer, Daddy." "So he does," Daddy laughed. "You're right." The little boy took compassion on his father. At first he did use camels. On Earth he'd lived in hot countries. Everyone did in those days. It was natural for him to choose camels. But presently the world grew larger. People went to live in cold places like Russia. The camels weren't so good on snow. Excuse my interrupting. Daddy's recent blunder had made him humble. It's a fact that you're telling me. Russian children still believe that Christmas presents are brought on camels. They believe that the 3 wise men ride out from the east every Christmas Eve, just as they did when they sought the Christ child. "They don't know?" the little boy broke in hurriedly. "Santa doesn't deliver presents that way any longer. Camels wasn't as quick on ice. One Christmas in Lapland he got stuck. 'Never again,' he said, and changed to reindeer." "I think he wasn't very wise," Daddy nodded gravely. "A camel's such a big animal to go prancing over roofs and chimneys." "And that was why, too, Daddy. So now we know, don't we?" "You know everything, Doodles. Poets do. You're a poet." Suddenly, Mackie hugged his father, crushed his face against the smoking jacket. "Somebody told me," he almost sobbed. "Somebody said there was no Santa Claus." "But there is. That's ridiculous. If there isn't a Santa Claus, how did he get into the encyclopedia? Encyclopedias print nothing but facts. They do really, I assure you, Doodles. Everything we found out about Santa Claus's boyhood is set down there in those large volumes. All about Befana, all about the ashes in the stocking, all about—" A tear-stained face glanced up. "Then tomorrow, let's prove it. Promise?" "If you know how to prove it, Doodles, I promise." A tap fell on the study door. Nanny's voice was heard announcing that Mac's bath was ready. "Don't come in 1 minute," Daddy implored. He bent over his little boy. "I promise. But how to prove it?" The child's voice sank to a whisper. "It's snowing. Tomorrow we'll go on the roof. If Santa truly is there, we'll find marks of reindeer and sleigh runners." Daddy had promised, and a promise is a promise. Next morning after breakfast, Christmas morning, having evaded Mummy and Nanny, father and son climbed the stairs to the attic, placed a ladder against the trap door, solemnly, and peered out. Not a sign of a reindeer's hoof or a sleigh runner. "But he's been, 'cause he's left the presents," Mackie whispered. For a moment he looked worried, and then his expression cleared. "How silly of us, Daddy. They wouldn't be here. We'll have to wait till next Christmas. A new lot of snow has fallen." So it had. Even the many streets which could be seen from so high up, there was scarcely a track noticeable. Mummy's voice calling, "What on earth are you 2 lunatics doing? Catching cold up there?" Daddy closed the tap hurriedly. As they scuttled down the ladder, he whispered, You're right again, Doodles. The new snow has fooled us. If you're still a poet, we'll try again next year. The end.